and service in a more urban or suburban area. So those are my concerns, is the economic aspects of it, and to ensure that it is accessible, and other issues as well as which is going on now with some of the people who are off the grid or unbanked, and will they still have access to it? So.
Excellent, thank you. I'll go back to a couple of people that, Dan, are you there? Do you want to answer the question? Bill O'Connor? Okay, I think, Pat, we've covered everybody unless there was some people that were on the phone and I'm not seeing them in the participant list, and might be a few people that are unable to at the moment, but I'll say that my concern would be how in the future AVs handle choice, and if they come into a situation where there's going to be an accident, how do they handle that? I've kind of seen some headlines about some ethics concerns about that recently. And then I'll turn it over to you, Pat, and you can finish up and introduce everybody and we can go on.
Great, thanks, Brian. Well managed. I'd share my concern, which is really related to the security of the software in the cloud environment, which of course will be paramount in certainly public AV management, with all of the creativity of the globe around hacking for very nefarious purposes. I'm concerned with that. But I have to say my eyes are opened to many of the concerns that our guests have shared this evening. Some really insightful comments, as Brian noted, quite often. So thanks. I see a hand up, Brian.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Dan, I tried to ask him a couple of times. I think he's
right. Yeah, I was looking for the unmute button. It's kind of challenging to find things without speeches.
Right.
Yeah. Did you have a question for me?
We were going around asking the question, what is your greatest concern regarding the development of autonomous vehicles?
Well, I'm sorry, I was in the other room. I would say my greatest concern would be the interface. Would it have a screen reader? Or, I don't like just doing things by voice because, Alexa fails. When my internet went out and I couldn't use my microwave. So I'm very suspicious of things that are voice only. I want things with buttons or a touch screen. And I would be concerned that it would have a screen reader. And then what do you do for someone who's blind? Braille. We don't have cheap enough Braille displays yet, but I think eventually we're going to see ubiquitous Braille. Instead of having a metal plate on an elevator, it'll be dynamic. So if the layout needs to change, you just update the software. We're not there yet, but I think it's coming.
Interesting. Also, one other, I thought I touched on John Willemi, but I saw he texted in the chat. John, do you want to read off your answer, or?
Sure. So what I said was, to secure comfort in the marketplace, there may be an opportunity for public municipal organizations to build out fleets so that the general population can adapt to the technology. So in other words, like what Pace and CTA has now, where they have the small little minivans roaming around the urban areas, picking up and delivering people, take that same concept and and to work, make it part of the autonomous vehicle deployment. So you just walk down the street and you see, oh, this PACE or this the CTA autonomous vehicle. People get comfort by seeing that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Brian. Group, I am also, as I turn it over to our speakers, I'm going to turn on the live captioning. I don't know how strong this is through Teams, and Brian always has language regarding on ITKAN meetings regarding requests for interpreters. And to my knowledge, we didn't receive one, but I'll do this, and if it seems to be manageable for the speakers, that's fine, and strong. If not, I'll turn it off. But thanks, everyone. I'm going to go to the next screen, which is Sheryl Gross-Glaser. And Sheryl, correct me if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly.
No, that's perfect.
Oh, thank you. I know I said glacier initially. So my apologies for that. Sheryl's and Carol's bios were, of course, shared in the invite and in the registration process, but I think the group would love to have you, Sheryl, and then you, Carol, introduce your bios, but maybe Sheryl, you can introduce your background as you present your content, and then Carol, as you present yours. I'm now going to go on mute to everyone's relief, I'm certain, and we'll get started. Sheryl and Carol, welcome.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I will just start. Thank you so much for allowing me to present. I really appreciate having the opportunity. And as a spoiler alert, I will answer a few of the questions. I totally agree with Carol Schweiger as usual, and she's probably said whatever I could say better than I can. When she said, the time is now to design AVs to be accessible and equitable rather than wait to retrofit them to make them accessible after they're introduced. If you need to rush off, you can go now. And I'll answer Amy Fong's concern about sharing, only in terms of, I think that we humans have very good memories and very bad memories at the same time. If you look at the outbreaks of the plague in medieval Europe or the outbreak of influenza 1918, 1919, it seemed that once whatever epidemic is gone, people move on very quickly and have short memories. So I'm not quite as concerned about COVID having the long-lasting effect in terms of people sharing. I assume that we'll go back to sharing.
Sheryl?
Yes.
Pardon me, this is
Sure.
Pat again. I think to save you and Carol the need to share your screens, you can just direct me. I'll be your slide person.
Great, great. And I want to say, by way of introduction, I'm going to be talking about completely full automation, so where there is not a driver. I'm happy if you want afterward to talk about partial automation, such as the Tesla Auto Assist. Okay, so next slide. So just a little bit about me. I've been working in transportation for about 13, 14 years. That's when I started at CTAA, the Community Transportation Association of America, and I was recently the founding director of N-CATT, the National Center for Applied Transit Technology. Amy Fong, who is with us on this call, has worked with me there. She was at FTA. And our goal at N-CATT was to help bring along the rural and small urban transit systems when it came to AV in terms of education and other technologies and microtransit and ride hailing and a whole plethora of other technologies. So I won't go any further into that. And I've been following AVs in particular for a long time. That's always been kind of my pet interest. My first career was as an appellate litigator for indigent defendants and habeas corpus petitioners. And I was the managing editor of a set of national criminal defense publications. So I've really spent my whole career in some way or shape or form related to equity of one kind or another. Next slide. So this is just a brief outline to show you where I'm going. I am not the most organized person, so I'll be going back and forth a bit, but we'll be getting to that, the end, my last slide, which is talking about what's possible but difficult, what's impossible, and hopefully energizing everyone to some extent. I am not an engineer. I have plenty of engineers in my family, so I know that their brains work differently. So I can't tell you what LiDAR sensor or what camera is better than another. You probably have more expertise than I have in that department. Next slide. So in terms of what we're going to keep in mind, Peter Norton is a professor at the University of Virginia. He's a great speaker if you ever have the opportunity to catch him when he talks about AVs or transportation history. And basically, you know, those details of equitable service and accessibility, those are all the devils, as I'll say, the devils in the details. Unless we push in some way or make sure that we require that certain aspects of AVs are embedded, as Carol said, that's a great word, we're not going to have it. So I'm going to kind of get back to this theme as we go along. And this is a photograph. I will read it in case anyone cannot see it. A sign just a couple of blocks from where I'm staying here in Asheville, North Carolina. I don't know whether this is an actual Dr. Seuss quote. It says, "Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better." It's not, which is true. We need people who are persistent, who won't let go. And I don't care whether it's civil rights, disability rights, voting rights, whatever it is, you need those people who are not going to let go of a particular cause, or else we're not going to change whatever it is we have now. Next slide. Okay, just making sure we're on the same slide because I'm looking at my notes. So what do we have now? We have a transportation system that is divided by class, and I don't mean necessarily economic class, but it's sort of based on where you live and what you have available to you, whether that's geographical or it's by virtue of wealth or by virtue of what shape you are in terms of physically, in terms of your senses, and in terms of your cognitive abilities. So the first class of people are people who have transportation. It works well. If something falls through, they have a backup. So that's whether you have a car and you can afford that to buy or lease a new car if something falls through with what you have, or it could be that you live in the middle of Brooklyn or Manhattan or those other few places where transit is great, and you also have a lot of shared use options at the ready. Are you in that second class where the transportation you have is unreliable or it's inconvenient, and maybe you have financial or other difficulties, so if whatever you have falls through? And then the third class is generally, which people with disabilities, I'll say, generally fall into, in that they don't necessarily have that backup option. If you need something that's accessible and you can't just ask a neighbor, can I use your vehicle, or can I catch a ride, or you can't just call up an Uber, or you don't have good transit, you're in this class. So despite the ADA, this is what we have, now. Next slide. And then we in various ways subsidize different kinds of transportation. So some people walk, some people use bike share, ride hailing, transit. Maybe in limited places you can use, an AV that's being piloted or tested. But for the most part, most people in this country are using privately owned vehicles on subsidized roads and using free or very low cost parking. Those are that mixture of how we fund transportation kind of points mostly to that privately owned vehicle as the main source of transportation for most people. Despite my Twitter feed and seeing lots of new urbanists always chatting about one thing or another, they're primarily in bubbles. They don't represent the whole country. Okay, next slide. So in a nutshell, we have this division between the states and the federal government in terms of how we regulate transportation, with safety and equipment testing kind of things being in the federal sphere, and then licensing, insurance, and some registration, some safety aspects in the state sphere. We're going to be combining that to some extent. When we combine, the driver will be the same entity as the vehicle with AVs. So we'll no longer have that split, but it as I'll say in the future, come back to that. That split in terms of what we have now is likely to continue. It's a comfortable split. Next slide. So we have a bunch of agencies, a bunch of federal agencies in some way or another have an interest in, or some kind of regulation that deals with automated transportation. And I put in at the FAA, which regulates air travel, and the FCC, which regulates communications in there, only because there's unmanned, unpersoned air travel that's also being tested. And then there's the whole issue of communication. So communicating with the vehicle, between vehicles, etc. That's a part of this. And next slide. State versus federal. So what is going to be continued to be regulated at the federal level versus the state level? And sometimes there's upsets in these, and there's kind of game playing, if you will. And Uber and Lyft are really the great examples of this, because we had taxi services that were regulated at the city municipal level, and Uber went above their heads, if you will, and went to the states and said, oh, legalize us at the state level, and just kind of completely thwarted the whole apple cart of how we regulated that taxi on-demand private sector. And then we have legislative versus, legislation versus regulation, all that. I'm not going to go into this in a big way because we could talk for a whole day about these things. And the reason why the word of the day is preemption is because when you have a new law, generally it'll say at a higher level. So let's say the federal level for the states, state level for municipalities. Often there's a limitation about what those entities under it, those lower entities, can or cannot do. And that's happening now with AV legislation. So the next slide. So what do we have? We have laboratories of democracy. One could call it a hodgepodge. One could call it a mess. No rational person would ever put together what we have now. And we could talk about the history of that, which is completely fascinating, but you're not here for that. But the one good thing that comes out of this hodgepodge is that we have these laboratories of democracy. So we have, next slide. We have a lot of experimentation in a way and kind of thought processing going on at the state and federal levels that are exhibiting these laboratories of democracy. We see a lot of different approaches. And I'll talk first about the federal and then about the states. So we do not have a federal law that addresses AVs. We've had a few examples of federal legislation. One went through, completely past the House, and it looked like something very similar would pass the Senate a few years ago. Did not happen, basically because of safety and regulatory concerns on the part of a few senators. But I think it's assumed, and I'll let anyone else, including my co-presenter, Carol Tyson, correct me here, but it looks like any federal law that we have is going to somewhat preempt what state laws can do. That will need additional funding for the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration and building of their capacity in order to fully and effectively regulate AVs. And we do not have any talk at this point in Congress or at the US DOT to broadly expand the American with Disabilities Act, the ADA, or to specifically expand what we mean by accessibility for AVs. So we're going to need some changes there if we're going to really concentrate on accessibility in the future and guarantee that. So what do we have going on in the states? We have a lot of state laws, a bunch of executive orders that have been issued by governors, and these are general categories. I've placed them in within each of these categories, platooning laws, laws that have required studies, laws that say, here, come, like Arizona, come here, test here, do whatever. We're not going to put too many barriers in your way. Laws more like California that are sort of a trust but verify system. We're going to require more from you. Laws that say, yes, we want you, but then they actually put some roadblocks in. And we do have a uniform state law commission model law about AVs that mostly looks at liability and has some interesting, particularly one interesting aspect. I'm not going to go into it because you could talk a long time about that, but the uniform state law model does exist for kind of a national set of regulating various legal issues. So it does stand out there. I don't think that's what we're going to end up doing, but it could be that states do adopt the ULC vision in terms of liability. Okay, next slide. So we have lots of testing and lots of pilots going on. And what I have on this slide are just a bunch of them that are going on in various states, some that are pilots. Most of these that I mentioned are AV shuttle pilots, and those are kind of have minimal, I'll call it minimal accessibility, so ADA accessibility, but not in terms of full accessibility. Somebody was talking earlier when we were discussing questions people were raising here in this meeting. So sort of that interface accessibility. What are you going to do if we have somebody who's both deaf and blind? How are we going to effectively communicate, let's say, with people with cognitive disabilities, all of that? We're not talking about that level of accessibility when we're talking about these AV shuttle pilots. We have Waymo, which is the Google subsidiary. They're now providing some limited service in a geo-fenced area in Phoenix, or I think it's a Phoenix suburb in Chandler, Arizona, and they're not providing accessible service. None of the private OEM, those are the car companies or the tech companies, are providing fully accessible service at this point. And they're using mostly, they're using vehicles that are, regular car companies have produced. So they're not using some new one. There were early on some companies that were starting from scratch, but that doesn't seem to be happening now. Mostly it's sort of these partnerships between tech companies and car companies, and then what's going on with some other companies in the AV shuttle field. Next slide. So there's a lot of unknowns. Someone was talking about serving people where they are. So are we going to require that everyone have door-to-door transportation? That's very expensive, and I assume it'll still be expensive even with AVs. We don't know what those maintenance costs are going to be for AVs. What are their lifespans going to be? So replacements. Are we going to continue with what's going on now? Amy Fong was talking about, what are we going to see of the legacy of COVID? Are we going to see greatly expanded telework and reduced transit demand? Are we going to exceed at some point an expansion of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or another law that greatly expands the rights of people with disabilities in the transportation sector? Are we going to see new business models when it comes to accessible vehicles? So I mention a few here only in terms of reminding myself of what my mother used to say sometimes, which is you put your money where your mouth is. So, when we're talking about school bus transportation and postal delivery, those are two business government funding models where we have said that no matter where you live, you are going to get equal service. That one is access to education, one is access to communication, basically, or what in the 19th century and for much of the 20th century was and even we saw in the election, was an important communication device of postal delivery. So when the United States has shown a commitment to transportation wherever you are, we've done that. We've done that with rural electrification during the New Deal and in the generation that followed, in terms of people wherever they are getting electricity. And we've seen that in a smattering of programs that deal with private purchase of vehicles. So we can expand transportation availability and access, but we would have to be willing to pay for that. Next slide. So when will we demand equity for people with disabilities? I don't know, but I do see some promise. Even in the current administration, there's been a good degree of funding and a good degree of lip service, which is usually a pejorative term, but I'm using it in a very positive way, about accessibility of AVs for people with disabilities. Whenever you hear the current Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao, who is the wife of the Senate Majority Leader. Whenever you hear her talk about AVs, she always mentions what great promise these hold for people with disabilities. Is she fully funding that? Obviously, she doesn't have the power to do that on her own. No, it is the US DOT requiring that. Are they being mandated by Congress to require that? No. But the fact that she's always putting that out there, the issue of accessibility, I think is important on its own. And if you look at the AV sort of governing documents, AV 2.0, which was put out by the Obama administration, 3.0 and 4.0 from this administration, they always at least mention accessibility. Now, they're not mentioning the magic between talking about it and making it happen, but it is out there, and I think that is important to mention. There has been a lot of work by the private sector and funding by US DOT and others for accessible interfaces. So, you know, what we have on buses, we have those clear announcements, those those audible announcements. We don't just have bus drivers shouting out your stop. That's just an example. And then you see the visual on a lot of buses, which is the stop. So we do have both of those. There's been a lot of work in terms of people with visual disabilities. And I think there is an awareness of people with cognitive disabilities as well. And I think just the fact that the accessibility market is growing is something that's promising, whether that's people who are older or others who self-identify as needing some kind of accessibility. But the concerns are that we don't have this official or kind of a movement to demand transportation accessibility in all of that fullness. And we do not have a private sector that is really embracing innovation. And I will point to the auto industry in particular. When it comes to that, I think that anybody from 1930 who drove an automobile at that time could, with not too much training, identify and drive a vehicle that we have today. There's really not been that much of a change. On the other hand, we have a lot of people who really enjoy accessibility where it is provided. I know I've heard Carol, my co-presenter, talk about the curb cut effect, but we have, you know, people with heavy luggage, people with strollers or soccer gear or wheelchairs who truly enjoy accessibility whether it's at a building, at a public building, or whether it's at an airport or a parking lot, and you have those curb cuts and other examples of accessibility. So that demand is not going away. We are only becoming a more accessible society. And Carol Schweiger's question about will that happen in time to embed accessibility into the technology, that remains the question. Next slide. So this election was really incredible. This is a headline from Monday. I'll read it in case anybody can't see it. It's from a newspaper called The Hill that covers Capitol Hill. And the headline is, regardless of party, the next Congress must prioritize disability issues. I don't know that I agree with that. But what I do agree with, and that is fact, is that the interests of people with disabilities, it's a sleeping giant, if you will. In the general population, people with disabilities represent 13.7% of the population, but in the Black population, which voted in record numbers, and I don't remember whether it was Joe Biden or Kamala Harris said that the election was partly due to the votes of people who are Black, but 1 in 4 African Americans has a disability. 1 in 4 women has a disability. So these are important interests in certain communities. So that, I think, in and of itself holds promise. Next slide, and we're getting to the end here. So let's put in one pile scientific facts, and in another engineering possibilities, and in a third what's politically possible. So in terms of scientific facts, we have to observe the laws of physics. We can't defy that. We're not going to be like Rumpelstiltskin spinning spinning straw into gold. But we already have what is possible engineering-wise, and we can only improve that, which is we already have accessible vehicles in transit. We already have many aftermarket improvements of traditional vehicles that render them accessible. So that cat is out of the bag. We're no longer creating something completely new. But in terms of our transportation system and policy, if you think of it as one big, great ship, like an ocean liner or a freight ship, it takes a lot of energy and effort to change course. And unless we push that big ship to change course, it will not change course. So just because it is possible, engineering-wise and politically, for us to have universally designed, fully accessible AVs, it doesn't mean we will. I would say we would need performance standards and not necessarily saying how we're going to do that. Let the private sector innovate. But unless we require that we have that kind of universal access approach, we're not going to have it. And unless there is that legal requirement in some shape or form, we're not going to have it. And so how are we going to do that? I don't know exactly, but I will tell you that in the last 2 months, I have switched from listening to the news to listening to history podcasts. At a certain point, I just couldn't bear the news anymore, the constant chatter and the going back and forth about what was important and what was, awful or not awful. And it was really turning my stomach. So I turned to various history podcasts. And one thing I will say to you is that history is a lesson. And we have various examples in the last 2 years, certainly in the last 50 years, of what has changed the course of history. We saw 9/11 roughly 20 years ago. We've now seen in the last year the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID just show how history can change course on a dime when events have taken place. But we've also saw the Voting Rights Act. We saw the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war movement, the Vietnam era, and the disability rights movement, where what was politically inconceivable years before became possible. We saw that with the suffrage movement and the one state legislator in Tennessee who moved in one direction rather than another. Otherwise, it might have been 20 or more years before we would have had the vote for women. So that's what history is not necessarily made up of what is rational for the next step. It's made of what actually happens or who happens upon the scene to change things. So I think we are going to have to all push for these things and advocate wherever we are, because that big ship of transportation will not move on its own, and how we have to all push in our own way to make sure that that ship changes course, so to speak. And next slide. I just, in the wake of my leaving CTA, I've created my own consulting firm, but I do not have a different email address yet or a website yet. My dream is kind of what we see in this slide, a bunch of people sloughing around, sleeping, reading, playing games, whatever, in an AV, and nobody having to drive and nobody being concerned about that. That doesn't mean there's not a lot of devil in the details when it comes to safety, but I think I speak for everyone when that's pretty much a bottom line American is apple pie issue. And it's something we do have to press for, or else we will see perhaps insufficient attention to that. But just like you get on an elevator, you get on an airplane, and it is not 100% safe, but it is incredibly safe. That is my hope for AVs, and my hope that they are fully accessible so that we no longer have this inequitable, mainly inaccessible transportation system that we have today. So, and I'm happy to take questions, but I urge you to listen to my fellow presenter because Carol is a wonderful presenter and she is an incredible advocate for people with disabilities, and she knows as much, probably more than me when it comes to AV. So I defer to her in all things, and I'm looking forward to her presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. This is Pat Group. I'll go back on mute and introduce Carol's slides and turn it over to you, Carol.
Thank you, Pat. Can you guys hear me? Hopefully you can.
Yes, I
so
can.
Thanks. So first, I want to say thank you for the invitation to join this evening and to learn from all of you, because that's what I've already done. So, and I want to say hello to some of the folks that I know. It's nice to hear your voices and see you. So you asked me to give just, I won't go through my whole bio. But, I started doing or sort of joined the disability advocacy community around 2012, 2013. I interned at Nickel. I was lucky enough then to get a job at United Spinal, where and United Spinal is very dedicated to accessible transportation. So I learned so much and became passionate, mostly because of my colleagues. And now I'm at the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, or DREDF. They're in Berkeley, California, but most folks, a lot of people know that. I'm in DC, so I am the Government Affairs Liaison. Okay, so what I'm going to do, this is pretty short. This is the short version of my presentation on AVs that I've given. So apologies to anybody that's had to sit through this before. What I'm hoping is for all of you at the end of this, amongst our conversation, this is what I am telling people wherever I go. So if you have feedback on what I should say that's not here, or say it differently, I always want to hear that. And I'm often speaking to a mix. Oftentimes it's a lot of folks without disabilities. So, okay, so for anybody that doesn't know about DREDF, we're on the next. Oh, and I wanted to share. I have one photo in this short slide deck, and when we get to that, I'll describe it. If I forget, please remind me to do that. So there's no photo here. This is just a slide on the background of DREDF. We're a legal and policy center led by people with disabilities and parents of children with disabilities. We seek a just world where all people with and without disabilities live full and independent lives free of discrimination. We advocate every single time across issues for integration and inclusion over segregation. And we believe very firmly in our hearts that access to mobility for everyone is a civil right. Next slide. Okay, so I think a lot of you know this. So this slide is titled Campaign for Lifts on Buses and Lessons. And I share this oftentimes with folks who don't know the history of accessibility and transportation. This is the slide with one photo, and it's two people who are sitting in their wheelchairs in front of an RTD bus. So in Denver, I think that the year is 1973, and they're blocking the bus. And then there are two men who are standing and walking and staring at them and wondering what the heck is going on, and they're in suits. So, but this is just sort of a representation of what it took to get the basic level of accessibility that we have in this country. And a lot of folks know, but that we had, I was not around then, but I have learned from colleagues arguments against accessibility at the time, and that's just lifts on buses, that's it, right? That was that it was too expensive or impossible, and that providing segregated service or paratransit would be cheaper than integration. And we know, of course, that is absolutely not true. It's not cheaper to provide a separate service. So the lessons that were learned from an advocate standpoint from that era are that accessibility is possible if it's a priority. It is cheaper if we do it at the outset. That user input and direction is vital at all stages, and especially at the beginning, but continuing through to forever. And Sheryl already mentioned the curb cut effect. So when we make things accessible, most people think it's great and aren't even realizing that it was initially for people with disabilities and access. Okay, next slide. So 30 years after the passage of the ADA in transportation, we see 98 or 99%, depending on what you read, of public buses are accessible, yet many bus stops, sidewalks, and transit stations are not accessible. There's limited access to transit or paratransit in rural and suburban areas. Passenger vehicle accessibility is extremely limited and expensive. And access has been an afterthought for every single new mode and service we have had since I've been thinking about this. So yeah, so that's where we are today. Next slide. This slide is entitled the AV Promise. So autonomous vehicles have the potential to absolutely transform mobility and people's lives. If the vehicles are designed to be safer and fully accessible, if the accessible infrastructure is prioritized. So the vehicle can be accessible, but unless we have accessible sidewalks, audible pedestrian signals, accessible transit facilities, it's not gonna help much. So, and those are things we can do right now. We don't have to wait for a new kind of vehicle to do that. And they're only going to transform our lives and increase access to mobility if we learn from the past. And this has already been said, but we have to require integration at the outset and push back against the we'll get to accessibility later mindset. Next slide. Okay, so DREDF has been thinking about AVs for a while. I was not involved in this, but DREDF authored the National Council on Disability Autonomous Vehicle Report, which was published in 2015. So in the AV world, it's actually pretty dated right now, but I think it's standing the test of time. Since the 2015 report, we put out just a short checklist. It's one page to help people sort of think through what does a fully accessible autonomous vehicle even mean? What would it need? And we really used it just to have discussions with stakeholders and with fellow disability advocates and try to figure out like what does that mean? And so what's on this slide is a summary of that one pager. And when we talk about a fully accessible vehicle, we're talking about access and equity. So we want a universal design of a vehicle and accessibility policies first off. So we want an accessible human-machine interface. So being able, for anybody, we're thinking cross disability. So for anybody to be able to communicate with the vehicle in whatever form they need to make that accessible, to find the vehicle and and for the vehicle to tell them where they are, where they're getting off, to be able to communicate in terms of when there's an emergency, all of those things. And then for the vehicle hardware to be accessible. So we're thinking about ramps, we're thinking about securement and just everything that we know already about vehicle hardware. In terms of policies, at the federal level and some of these at the state level as well, making sure there's anti-discriminatory licensing and insurance provisions so that they're not saying, they're definitely not going to help the disability community if you have to have a license, like a driver's license like we have now. So somebody who can't get a license now will not be able to use the AV. So we need very definite anti-discriminatory licensing provisions, and also compliance with the ADA on not increasing insurance for somebody with a disability, which is in the ADA, but a lot of people don't know that. And we need accessible autonomous vehicle crashworthiness. So we need the vehicle to be safe, and we need occupant and pedestrian safety requirements. So these I heard in the beginning people saying were important, and we agree. We want to see improved infrastructure, which includes the sidewalks, but also broadband access so that people can communicate with the vehicle if they need to, and then funding for travel training as well. I heard some folks mention equity policies. We are advocating for that here. We want to make sure that autonomous vehicles ensure or benefit communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color and underserved communities. We want to make sure that there are workforce transition plans because people with disabilities are riders, but they also work in the transportation industry. And we want to make sure that that those folks have jobs. We want to see not just compliance with the ADA and going above and beyond, but also compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and the Environmental Justice Executive Order. So getting to the thoughts around congestion and pollution, how is this affecting our communities and making sure we're not causing harm. Okay, next slide. So I think I saw in the sort of description of this evening's talk, sort of what are we doing? And so this is my abridged one slide on what we've been doing for, I'll say, the last maybe 3 years. And I've broken this out into federal and state advocacy. And then work we've been doing with the manufacturers and the other stakeholders. So at the federal and state level, DREDF published a report in 2015, the NCD report. And there have been several other reports out by disability organizations on the need for accessibility in AVs. The U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of Transportation held a listening session a couple years ago with advocates here in DC and also in California to hear from the community what we wanted. And they wrote a report on that listening session, and you can find it online, and I have links at the end of this. So you can see what we said, and you can decide if we left anything out, which we probably did. And been continuing to engage pretty steadily with the Department of Transportation's, their Office of the Secretary, and NHTSA as well, which is the administration that deals with safety. The Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities, which is a coalition here in DC of roughly 100 disability-related organizations, has a set of AV principles. It's available online. 22 national disability organizations put that together. And we've been using that to talk with Hill offices to explain why we need accessibility requirements and all of the policies that I talked about in any legislation. DREDF has been working very closely with safety advocates here in DC. We don't want anybody to tell somebody with a disability they can't use an AV because it would be unsafe, but we want to make sure that vehicles are safe for everybody before anyone gets in. So we are working with them. And then just on the state level, is very recent, the California Public Utilities Commission has put out a proposed decision on what the requirements would be for autonomous vehicle operators to test and deploy the vehicles in their state. They really said very little on accessibility, and DREDF just submitted a letter very recently saying that we feel like they're not meeting their ADA obligations. That they do need to require accessibility, and we lay out the legal arguments and what we want them to do, which includes at the very, very, very basic level, an accessibility plan from any autonomous vehicle operator of how they're going to provide accessible service in the future. There's been a lot of engagement with the car manufacturers and other stakeholders. There's a coalition called We Will Ride of, I think it's 5 disability organizations that sent a letter to the car manufacturers or OEMs, letting them know that we that accessibility is important, and we'd like to talk with them, and we want to make sure that they're committed if they're going to use the disability community as a talking point for how great AVs are going to be. We've had several conversations with a handful of those car manufacturers. VW is, to my knowledge, the only car manufacturer that is committed publicly to producing a fully accessible autonomous vehicle. You can find more. It's called the Inclusive Mobility Initiative, and they have partnerships with organizations. And then just finally, last year, the Auto Alliance, which is I like kind of the coalition of the manufacturers, had 3 one-day accessibility workshops to think through, and the disability community was invited. They allowed for a lot of presentations at the beginning of each day, and then we had breakout groups, and we talked about what was needed, what the barriers are, and came up with some recommendations. And they put all of those presentations online, and they're still up, and then they wrote a report, and that's up and available as well. There's been a lot of other discussions with various stakeholders. And I would echo what Sheryl already said. There's been a lot of talk, and it's good. I'd rather people be talking about it, but there's no real commitment, and there are no requirements yet. So next slide. This is just the thing I always say at the end here. We are in a moment of reimagining mobility, and anything is truly possible. We need to hold each other and ourselves accountable to principles of equity and justice. My contact information is at the bottom. And then if you could go to the next slide. Just 2 slides of resources here for anybody that wants them. So links to all the various things I mentioned and more. So I think that's it. That's my formal presentation. I wanted to mention 2 quick things. Someone mentioned at the beginning the concern around not allowing someone who's blind to be a passenger without the emergency backup. And I wanted to let you know, this is certainly not a promise or a commitment, but that the folks here in DC are talking about that, and the advocates. I've had conversations with safety advocates and tried to explain why it's not okay to require there be a steering wheel in the vehicle, because then we're probably going to create an unintentional barrier to some passengers. So we're thinking a lot about that, and want to make sure that no matter what, everybody gets to use the vehicles. And then we are engaged also with NHTSA's looking at and reforming the federal motor vehicle safety standards. I think that's it. I'm going to stop talking. Thank you.
Thank
very
you,
much.
Carol, so much. This is Pat Group again. Sheryl and Carol, this was very, very enlightening presentation for me personally, and I expect for many of our guests. I'm going to ask Brian to manage Q&A. Should we have any questions? What I'll ask of the group is if you can click on the raise hand icon at the top of your screen on the right side. If you want to verbalize a question, option 2 would be to enter your question in chat, and Brian will manage that between our 2 incredible speakers. And I'm going to go on mute and let him do that.
Carol Schweiger says she has to leave, and thanks Sheryl and Carol for excellent presentations, and thoughts about how to address accessibility of AVs? Tim?
I'm never shy, so I'll try to get us rolling with the question. So, what usually drives economically the justification of autonomous vehicles? I would hope that one of them would be helping underserved communities like the disability community have jobs and ultimately give back to the economy. But I don't know today, when areas are looking at autonomous vehicle, what's really driving it from an economic perspective, to make it happen.
I'll jump in. This is Cheryl. There's rationales given. Safety is a very big one that, it's often repeated, sort of a misleading statistic that 94% of crashes are caused by the human driver, or I think in some way are contributed to by the human driver. And so therefore automated vehicles, fully automated vehicles will be safer. So that's kind of the baseline rationale given. But I think we all know that really money is behind a lot of it. I mean, the car companies, ride-hailing companies, tech companies, they're all there's a lot of good people there, so this is not to say anything negative about them, but they're companies. They need to make money in order to survive, and everybody sees a big pot of gold at the end of the AV rainbow. If we replace every vehicle we have, if we suddenly have a whole new market of people who can't drive right now or don't want to drive, suddenly purchase these things or purchase rides in AVs, there's a lot of money to be made. And that money is really what's fueling the incredible amount of investment that we're seeing in AVs. But I'll let Carol comment as well.
So this is Carol. I think, is it Tim?
Yes. Yes.
So I certainly, the argument is made many times over that for increasing access for people with disabilities to jobs, and the Office of Disability Employment Policy has done an amazing job of getting that out there, and that's great. I am a pretty cynical person, so I don't think that's the driving force. I think Cher already mentioned that it's money and it's profit in my mind, and I will add, and this is also it's very cynical, but I think it's true, and you're not going to hear the transit agencies or Uber or Lyft admit this, but paying drivers is very expensive. and dealing, if you're a transit agency, with the labor unions, is for them, oftentimes I think they consider it a headache, and there's a lot of just back and forth around how much they're having to pay. So I think this is a solution in their minds, and also for like Uber and Lyft. So I think that is a piece of it. Which is why we try to keep the worker transition piece in mind. So yeah, that's it.
As a follow-up, to remind, part of the reason I asked is sort of advocacy of, just like the disability community votes, the disability community also consumes, right? And there is, and I'm sure it's a very obvious statement, right? There's a great consumption model there where it would be leveraged and can be commoditized, and there's nothing wrong with making a profit over things that are moving things forward. And I think that same reminder, the disability community votes also, hey, there's a lot of consumers in the disability community that would take advantage of it. And hopefully the trade-off for making it accessible will equal more profits for them because they'll have more consumers.
I'd say this is Carol again, absolutely. But there's less and less talk. Well, I hear much less talk of people actually purchasing the vehicles, and much more about them being used in fleets.
Yeah.
But still, people will consume that because
Yeah.
the way they have in the disability community as well. So,
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll just chime in. We also have to think about other kind of, I'll call them quote unquote unprofitable communities. Part of the reason why the car companies are not pushing on their own, or tech companies pushing on their own to provide completely accessible service is, they don't want to add any expense. They already have these vehicles that are made. We know how to make them. And it would add expense to the research and development to some extent, although, as I said before, we already have accessible vehicles and know how to make them. So I'm not sure that's much of an argument. But how do I say this? Unless they're pushed, as Carol said, we're not going to do this. Somebody asked, what can we as the disability community do? And I think as much as the disability community can show itself to be a unified force on this is good, as much as it can show itself to be a market that companies can make money off of if they are served well is good. As much as you can talk to your political leaders and sort of say, hey, we're here and we are interested in this, I think that's good as well. And if you know someone who leads a car company, please feel free to speak with them.
Michelle Lee has a couple questions. Michelle, if you want to come off mute and ask, or I can read if you prefer.
Hi, everyone. It's Michelle Lee. Hi, Pat. So my question was, what can we do to advance these initiatives? And I know we in the disability community all want these vehicles to be accessible, equitable, and equally available. So I guess, Sheryl, you kind of answered the question, but I guess mainly those all sound like great ideas, and we're all, we all would love to know somebody at a car company we could talk to, personally. But what can we, how can we make sure that these big corporations don't forget people with disabilities, which is oftentimes the case? Thank you.
So this is Carol. One thing that DREDF has done, and we're going to try to make it easier for other folks to do, is and I mentioned we recently submitted the letter to the California Public Utility Commission, because right now in a lot of states they're trying to figure out what are the rules going to be that they give to car companies to test and deploy these vehicles. And we have said in California just recently that one of the rules needs to be, of course, we believe you need to require accessibility, but if you're not going to do that, then we want you to at least require that there be a plan from these companies of when they will require accessibility, and then you need to share that with the public. So putting pressure on these companies through our states and our cities. So we're going to turn the letter into a template so people can use it, but that would be one thing to do around the country, and then to just talk to congressional offices and let them know that it's important to you. But at the state level, a lot of states are very active right now, and if they don't have a accessibility advisory committee for their AV plans, pushing for that as well and becoming involved.
Awesome, thank you.
And this is Sheryl. If in the last few years, a bunch of states, some cities have put out AV plans. They're not really plans so much as kind of thinking documents. And there's very few that really explore issues of equity or accessibility. It's not uppermost in their minds, because there's somehow this assumption that whatever we have now will just be the same, but automated. So in order for kind of that mindset to change. We all have the responsibility to some extent to change that and to raise these issues, because there's just a lot of assumptions that are made that we need to question, that we need to just say, hey, but what about this or what about that? It's not that there's anything malicious going on. It's just that, you know, if you live in a place where everybody takes a car, no one ever takes transit, you're not really thinking about other modes. You're not thinking about land use necessarily to support a good shared use transportation system. You're not necessarily thinking about kind of broad issues of affordability. So we have to keep that in mind, you know, when we're talking to legislators at the state or federal level, is that those folks are not necessarily thinking about these issues because they're thinking about a ton of other things, right? And in order for them to think about this when the subject of the AVs comes up, we have to keep, you know, just reminding them.
Great. Steve Luker typed in the chat here, one thing I am almost certain of is that there are a lot of things societies don't consider when costs are figured out. For instance, people ought to think about, both the cost of accessibility, but also the hidden costs of not having accessibility. The person who has better accessibility will be a much better support system. Otherwise, it will fall to the government. I am not getting together with family or friends, the human connection. If I am not getting together with family or friends, the human connection gradually will weaken, and so will their sense of responsibility.
This is Cheryl. That's exactly right. You know, Transit Center did a study within the last year or two about people with low incomes who use transit, and we sometimes divide transit riders into choice riders and then people who are kind of have no choice. And they looked into that sort of that no choice rider, if you will, and so that it's really a much more complicated picture than we've been led to believe, in that a lot of people just forego trips rather than taking what can be lousy transit service sometimes. Whether it's they don't feel safe getting off at a bus stop and crossing the street, there's no traffic signal, whether it's because transit only operates 5 days a week and not on weekends or not in the evening, whatever it is, that people are behaving in a rational manner, but it's kind of behind the scenes. It's not always paid attention to how it affects people's lives. So again, these are issues that we have to raise and humanize. When the ADA was passed, I know Tom Harkin was from Iowa, was a real force behind that, and I know Tammy Duckworth has done a lot of work. She has a disability herself, and she's pushed disability issues. So, you know, humanizing that aspect of access and what it means to people is very important, that it's not just a safety issue. It's also whether you can get somewhere or not is going to depend on whether something is accessible and whether it's affordable and whether it is available in an equitable manner. So we really have to inform all those folks who represent us the full picture, and do it as much as possible in a unified way, but really humanize it to them, because people will remember a human story and anecdote more than they're going to remember the statistics, and it'll really spur them more than a statistic necessarily will.
Great. Cecilia?
Hi, yes, I just want to follow off from what Steve and from what Cheryl said about the cost of, well, the cost of doing it versus the cost of not doing it. I work a lot with people with autism and developmental disabilities, and there was a study. It hasn't been published, but I saw it in a poster session, just for like adults on the autism spectrum. A lot of it was focused on children, but then the impact of not having proper services for people after they age out of school, and the huge impact it had on families, and all of these other costs that people didn't even think about, family members becoming either unemployed or underemployed to take care of them. And we see this a lot with for transportation. It's just so plentiful of providing that service, and the other impacts it costs to society. And there's a lot of studies been done with seniors not having access to transportation and the health impacts, and then those costs to society. So I'm wondering if something, maybe to do something and then have those anecdotal stories of just the cost of not being inclusive and accessible versus being inclusive. Because if you can put those, both the numbers, and I think they're going to be huge numbers, as well as the stories, that probably can make a huge impact. Because when people see like the millions and billions of dollars that it costs society, I was just looking that in 2014 it cost 2.4 billion to support somebody with autism through their lifespan, and that's not even including all those other what would they call it, like the other impacts that weren't factored in. Those were just the direct cost. So I'm thinking just maybe to focus on some of those as well in the work we're doing.
I don't, this is Cheryl. Cecilia, it's nice to see you again. And I don't want to be depressing, but I think we have to look at other spheres and not assume anything. And I'm thinking right now about childcare, right? I mean, we've had working parents, where we haven't assumed that mom is home. We're now in our second or third generation of that, and yet do we have childcare provided for families who can't pay for it, let alone provided in an equitable way throughout society? No. And that's a pretty much a basic service. Do we have even equal education across the board? No. So I don't think we can make any assumptions. We're not great in this country at helping people, supporting people to live their lives. We have a very funny relationship with poverty and kind of blaming people for it often. So I think it's going to be a big push, an uphill push, even more than providing accessibility is providing affordability.
All right, Bill O'Connor has a comment. Bill, if you want to come off and read it, or I can read it if you prefer. Bill might be having audio problems. I'll read Bill's comment. Definitely, as auto driving as a tech model and finding a proper business model, the disability community will become a new market to help increase net profit. This presentation has been insightful. See, Tim is typing something in. Bill is as well. Oh, Tim had a drop. Yes, I can put in a question. I might have missed it, Cheryl, earlier in your presentation, but just kind of wondering, since a lot of the AV sphere right now is kind of in a testing mode in various areas, what kind of regulations and laws have been written, and at what level is, who's been the first to jump in? Has it been the federal government or local or state?
Mostly it's been the state governments that have been active. The federal government has been, the US DOT has been somewhat active, but more in an encouraging mode, I would say, than in, requiring mode or fully funding. I've seen the idea of having competitions or challenges raised. I mean, that's one way to go about things, not necessarily even just to fund programs. There have been some programs, and I know Carol and Amy Fong was at least on the meeting earlier, could probably talk about this from her time at DOT. There's been various programs to encourage AV development and encourage accessibility as part of that. The states have been more active in terms of regulating and legislating for AVs, but not on the accessibility front. And no one has really talked about, like, what are we actually going to charge for a ride or charge to purchase a vehicle or anything like that, because that's unknown. And I know somebody was talking about the unknown costs earlier. And I think that's very true. We really don't know what these are going to cost, whether in terms of purchase, per ride, what is it going to take to maintain them? Unlike with a human-driven vehicle where, maybe your one of your lights is out or something's not working quite right, so maybe you drive a little slower, in other ways make up for that a little bit. With AVs, are we going to have an AV cleaned much more frequently, because its cameras and sensors have to be able to be perfectly clear all the time? How much downtime are they going to need? What's going to be the cost in terms of constant software updates? Because I assume that software updates are going to be a big thing when it comes to AV. So there's a lot we don't know. We don't know what's going to be with geographic availability. I presume that being in the middle of Chicago or New York or San Francisco, you'll probably be able to get an AV to take you on your short ride. But will that be the case in very low density rural areas? And will you have, let's say, if there's a requirement that a certain percentage of AVs be accessible, what is the real service going to be on the ground for that person in a wheelchair in a rural area? These are all questions we do not have the answers to, and that really have not been explored that much at this point.
I guess kind of a follow-up to that, I'm wondering if in some sort of future scenario where somebody is crossing the line from like Southeast Chicago into Northwest Indiana in an autonomous vehicle, do we get some sort of, regulatory mess because we have different states as well as different municipalities involved, and just would that slow things down too much, or are we looking at, federal government is going to, oversee things a lot more?
I'm going to say that depends. And what it depends on is, are we going to have privately owned vehicles mainly like we have now, where you're in a car, either as a passenger or a driver, and that car crosses the state line and you hardly notice except to say, oh, look, we're in Indiana now.
Yeah.
But if it's shared use and transit, right now you have transit that stops at county lines, let alone state lines. So it's not necessarily a regulatory issue. It may be a funding issue that here in Chicago, you get in an AV, we'll fund that, but we're going to only fund that up to the city line or the state line. Now, the more these issues affect your basic middle class person, the more they'll be paid attention to. But when you're talking to people who are going to need subsidies of some kind, that creates a whole different thing. I think it is the nightmare of any company that's thinking about, what if we have this fleet model, of shared transportation, whether shared rides or consecutive rides, right? But the person in the vehicle doesn't own it. It would be their nightmare to have this mishmash hodgepodge of regulation and funding. They do not want that, and they have a lot of lobbying power on Capitol Hill. So I think just by virtue of that, they've always figured out over the past several generations how to make money and to lobby for the kind of regulations and laws they want. And I assume they will continue to do so. It's really those communities that are smaller in some way or have less money that have cause to be concerned.
And Steve Luker echoes that concern about moving people from between cities and from county to county. I see Maureen Reed had her hand up. Maureen?
Yeah, hi. One of the concerns that I expressed earlier, and I had to hop away, so please do tell me if you've already addressed this, but I still have concerns about congestion, right? Like any of us moving in a vehicle in Chicago have already experienced traffic. And so when we talk about adding the autonomous vehicles, I'm curious if they're doing sort of any anticipatory research on how that will impact existing congestion.
There's been lots of research on this and lots of papers and, guesses. I'll call them educated guesses, go anywhere from we could make congestion much worse because you could have an AV going from somebody's garage empty to pick them up, or even going alone to the supermarket to pick stuff up or to pick the kids up or whatever, which will add vehicles to the road, to we will be in this shared use utopia. And anything in between, is somewhat possible. I would guess that we're not going to be in either of those ends of the spectrum, but we really don't know. I'd say the worst threat in some ways is just the assumption that things will be the same. And you've probably all, or many of you may have seen there's like a pretty common image of 3 photographs. You have 60 cars taking up like a whole road. Then you have, one bus, which has the same number of occupants as those 60 cars. And then you have 60 people either standing in the road or on bikes. And the message basically is those 60 cars they're taking up too much room. They're not the way to go, right? So if those cars are suddenly AV cars, we're not solving a lot of the problems we have today.
Can I add to that, Cheryl?
Yeah.
I would just say, so in my slides, there's a report that the Greenlining Institute put out a couple of years ago, and Cheryl mentioned there's been a ton of research done on this, your question. But I think it's like one of the most sort of basic and accessible reports on this issue, and it's called AV Heaven or Hell, and it lays out like this. These are all the different ways this could go, and unless we're thoughtful about it, it could just be, it could make everything much worse. So I love that report, and I always mention it. And I also want to say also that really the use in urban areas, at least, of like TNC, of the transportation network companies, Uber and Lyft, has been, a lot of people talk about that as a test run for autonomous vehicles, in terms of, how we might regulate. And I just point to New York City as, one place where they did think about congestion and did act on it successfully, and did say like, actually, no more, like we're gonna pause, no more licenses allowed, and we're gonna study So it is possible, even though the companies don't want you to think that it is, to be thoughtful and push back.
Thank you
I'll
both.
oh, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say thank you both. I'll make sure that I access that report that you mentioned, Carol.
It's a great report, and Carol's checklist is also wonderful because it's really a succinct list of what has to be provided in order to consider these vehicles fully accessible.
Well, this is Pat Group. We are at the top of the hour. I've been so intrigued by the level of discussion, which is not unusual with our meetings, but I think what we would ask is any further follow-up questions be directed to Sheryl and or Carol, who have both provided generously their contact information within the presentation deck. With that said, Sheryl and Carol, really fascinating. What I came away with was the complexity and layers to this development of autonomous vehicles and the myriad questions that are in process or yet unasked. I think the final thought is more to come, I suppose. And I'll leave it, Sheryl, to you, and Carol, to you for any closing comments.
This is Sheryl. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me for this wonderful conversation. And just as a parting note, the story is yet to be written, and we have the power to change the course of how it's written, and hopefully in a very positive way.
And this is Carol. Just thank you all very much for this great conversation and for all the work that you do every day.
Well, thanks again, both of you. And I want to thank Brian, first off, for managing the tech during this meeting and being my co-moderator and doing it with aplomb, as he always does. Thanks to everyone for your insights. This was really an extraordinary conversation, I thought. So thanks, everyone. Stay safe. Happy Thanksgiving and holidays, whichever holiday you celebrate or series of holidays, and be well. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.
You too, Joan. See you, Dries.